Welcome to the Impact Learning Visionaries podcast, where we celebrate the unsung heroes of the learning and development industry. As always, we'll be bringing some laughter and a bit of fun along the way, but more importantly, you'll get some incredible insights, key lessons, and unique perspectives on everything related and possibly unrelated to training and development. Let's get this show on the road. Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Impact Learning Visionaries. And today we are joined by Cathy Hoy, who has over 2 decades worth of experience in the field of learning and organizational development. She's worked with some incredible brands from British Gas, Expedia, Tesco, Coca-Cola European partners, and Cathy is an absolute guru when it comes to shaping global learning, cultivating talent, and developing and rolling out cultural strategies that are successful and significant. She's now the CEO of CLO 100, which in collaboration with the Leeds University Business Schools offers L&D leaders a 12-month program focused on preparing them with the necessary and critical skills for transforming their organizations in learning and development. And as I understand, she's just launched the first cohort. So exciting conversation ahead. Welcome, Cathy.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. That was a lovely intro. Thank you.
Thank you. I practice it all day. So let's start. Let's start with the CLO 100. So there's obviously a purpose behind it, an intention. Where did the idea originate from?
So it was really a kind of joint idea between myself and my business partner, Robert Wagner. We were having a conversation about the industry generally. You know, my background, as you said, is very much internal, in-house roles, heading up L&D teams. Robert's background was previously involved with the kind of CIPD world and reselling CIPD qualifications. You know, I felt that there was a lack of a lack of options to prepare learning and development managers to become heads of learning and to become chief learning officers and actually have that kind of strategic level of influence in their organisation. And I certainly noticed it myself. You know, the first time I took an L&D role that reported to the board, I realised how ill prepared I was. And I think, you know, Robert's frustration kind of came from, well, actually CIPD is brilliant, but it is incredibly focused on HR and HR generalism. And actually, you know, we thought between us, well, there's nothing here. So actually, this is a space that we'd both really love to see do better. And as a personal mission, we'd love to see more CLOs generally in the world, but particularly in the UK. It's certainly something you see more of in the US. But yeah, we'd just love to see more strategic level L&D leaders.
Cool. So just question I'm quite curious about is, so you talked about your kind of first experience of having a seat at the table and realizing that you hadn't really been equipped for what that meant, and the kind of skills required to navigate that experience. So I guess like my key question here is I'm curious as to, you know, what are those skills? What is kind of built into this CLO 100 course, which is giving people, because there's a lot of confidence and experience in being able to go toe to toe with people in C-level positions, but what are the teachable skills to kind of help navigate that?
Yeah, great question. So I think that there are some more kind of generic skills that I think everybody really needs when you're operating at a senior level, and you've got a board level position. And those are really around kind of commercial awareness, essentially, is where it boils down to. You know, understanding how the business works, understanding how it ticks, you know, what drives your other stakeholders, but also kind of key skills around that, like strategic thinking and internal influencing. Those are really necessary at that level if you want to, I guess, have a voice in that space. And so we cover that side of things, but we also say, well, what should an L&D leader, an L&D director be bringing to that table that's their kind of specialist subject? And that's what the rest of the program focuses on. So things like how do you create a psychologically safe learning environment in your organisation? How do you build a growth and learning mindset? how do you effectively market learning, and from an innovation perspective, what's next on the horizon? We hear a lot about AI at the moment. I mean, it's everywhere, you can't escape it, but actually what does that look like for L&D, and how can we be kind of thought leaders in that space? So I think it's a bit of the kind of general sort of skills around that kind of broad term commercial awareness, where I would imagine every director should be kind of bringing that level of knowledge. And then you've got your own kind of specialist area, really. So we try to cover both on the programme.
So I'm quite curious, because I know that it's, obviously you've seen a real need for this, but it's curious to me is I'm just trying to kind of formulate this question, because the challenge, obviously, as I see it, is as you kind of go into your kind of career and you build up and you get exposure to more and more kind of senior level roles, there's a lot of this knowledge and experience that's distilled to you, so that by the time you probably end up in a CLO type role or a senior L&D type of role, you would expect to have a lot of these skills, but by nature of the fact that you guys are putting this course together, that's not happening. So obviously there's there's some kind of core problem here that's kind of in place, that's giving like a need to this type of learning in the industry. And like, what do you attribute that to?
Yeah, I think there's a few things, actually. One is, generally by nature, being in learning and development, you put all of your time and effort into developing people in your organisation. They're your customer base, your internal customers, and it's really rare that L&D, just stop for a moment, look up and go, hang on a minute, what about my development? And actually it's difficult as well in the organisation to even say, I'd like to invest in myself, because people have this assumption, I think, that if you're in learning and development, well, you should know everything because you're training other people. And that's obviously a ridiculous concept. We can't know everything, but also we have to keep our own skills sharpened so that we can be more effective for our organisation. So I think there's just a general lack of focus on ourselves because of the nature of the role we're in, to be honest. But it's kind of embarrassing given our industry, really. We should always be leading by example and investing in our own development. I think there's also the lack of awareness of just at different levels of learning and development roles as well. And there's Lauren Waldman, probably better known as the Learning Pirate, is doing some great work in this space to raise awareness at that kind of learning designer, learning facilitator phase as well. It's kind of, actually, you're in learning and development, you may have well been in these roles for, 10, 15 years. Actually, you don't know anything about neuroscience, you don't know anything about how the brain works and how learning actually happens and how we build memory. And, that's essential. And I think that so I don't think it's just a head of learning role. I think it's all throughout learning and development. We are not taking it seriously enough, our own profession and our own development.
It's a fascinating observation, because many years ago I came across this term called "never trust a skinny chef," and essentially the premise is that if you're going out there serving kind of fine dining, but you're not really eating your own food and testing your own product and doing essentially what you're expecting other people to do, that there's an element of trust that's missing in that conversation. And that was the thing that popped into my head as you were talking, because the head of learning and development is almost trapped in that same type of situation, and it's pervasive across the industry. I mean, some of the worst people at like accountants are notorious at being very bad at managing their own personal finances, and it always seems like when you're in the industry in that particular silo, you're really bad at doing that for yourself almost. So it's kind of fascinating that applies to learning and development. I guess then the big question for me is obviously you guys are doing this now. It's kind of the CLO 100, but there's foundational skills that by the time you're leaving it to kind of people who are probably more senior in the role, they're kind of going through almost like a massive level up, as opposed to these fundamental skills being introduced along the way. I mean, do you see that as being something that's possible in the industry? Is there just like a fundamental kind of disconnect? Is the thinking in the industry still very old school? Where do you see that kind of roadmap?
Yeah, I do think a lot of the thinking's still quite old school, but then there are some people doing some brilliant work, and I've already kind of referenced Lauren, but there's also someone that was actually a personal mentor to me many years ago when I worked at Tesco was Paul Dunn, runs a company called P3 Training, and he was incredibly advanced in terms of the sorts of knowledge and skills he was imparting into learning and development professionals at the time. And he really was taking a lead from neuroscience and actually almost letting us know about it without really making it too overt. And so for me, it gave me a really good grounding. And I know he's been doing some brilliant work across the industry, but there's not enough of that happening, definitely. I still think there's this, bizarrely, I've still come across every now and again organisations that still aren't really embracing virtual training, which I find fascinating. I thought sort of everybody was kind of on that bandwagon now. Although I have to say as well, even with that, we see a lot of businesses that have kind of taken the essentials of virtual training and gone, okay, we can use Zoom, we can use Teams, let's crack on and just transfer a classroom training session to an online session. That's just not how it works. It would be like taking that same content and creating an e-learning module, and for any e-learning designers out there, you'd know that was like the worst possible thing you could do. You have to look at it as a completely different thing. So I do think there's still a long way to go in the industry, but our thinking was let's kind of start with this senior level in terms of the impact they can have, not only on their teams and themselves, but actually on their entire organisation. So, but I do think there's definitely a kind of gap for kind of more junior levels as well within our industry. I definitely think some more kind of forward thinking training and experience and exposure is great. And really needed. I think that there's loads of great people out there doing some brilliant work. Dr. Keith Keating and his new book, The Trusted Learning Advisor. I think that goes a really long way actually to explaining what learning and development professionals should be doing. And actually, can we really call ourselves a professional or a practitioner if we're not doing these things? Erica Farmer and Quantum Rise, they've got a great podcast called AI for the Average Joe. And actually that's great because if you're in L&D and you're scared about AI and you're thinking, where do I start? It's a really very practical kind of series. So I think there's some brilliant people doing some great things to really start getting the L&D industry to think differently. But we just need a lot more of it, I think.
Yeah. And I guess that for me is one of the fundamental challenges is that, historically the industry was almost positioned as a almost terrible analogy, but you were kind of like the window, like the clerk at the window of the driver, the DMV or whatever the analogy is that you're waiting for someone to come to you and then you were kind of responding to that request. And whereas so much has fundamentally changed, and I think there was this almost tacit understanding that learning was important, but the operations of the business and profit was more important. And now I think there's almost there's been this realization that behind every successful business is actually the people who run and operate that business. And the challenge of businesses is to empower those people and enable them to be innovative, to be creative, to be disruptive, to be excellent. And almost it's elevated this learning and development kind of function into much more of a visible function in the organization, but juxtaposed against a world that's rapidly changing. I mean, you talked about neuroscience, you've talked about AI, there's all of the technology, remote learning, experiential learning, all of these different concepts are all kind of coming in and having conversations, and the head of learning or the learning and development role is suddenly becoming a very complicated role to navigate. And I guess that's kind of where your course is originating, kind of stemming out of. But I guess the question coming out of all of that is how do you navigate all of that complexity? Because you can be a jack of all trades, master of none. You can have a just barely good enough approach and kind of try and understand, or you could decide to focus on specific areas. What do you think is the right approach?
I think it really depends on too many factors, actually. I think it depends a lot on the individual. I think it depends a lot on the industry that they're in, the culture within the organisation. It's probably too difficult to say. I think like with everything, unfortunately, there's no, one size fits all. I often wish there was. But you said something really interesting a moment ago when you were like, well, actually, it was a case of, a business is focusing on kind of profit, or are they focusing on learning? And I think that's where learning and development haven't done a very good job, because ultimately the business should be realising, and this is our job to educate the business, that learning and development equals more profit in your organisation. Because, if we can't actually connect the learning initiatives that we're implementing in our businesses to the strategic direction of the organisation and how it actually contributes to organisational success, why are we doing them? We shouldn't be wasting time or resources on something that isn't going to help the business move forward in some capacity. And whether that's helping them make money, or whether it's by, improving sales skills or customer service skills or product training, or whatever it might be, or whether we're saving them money through improving employee engagement and reducing, staff turnover. But actually, that's what learning and development leaders need to be thinking about when they're having conversations with businesses, not just kind of, what do you think your team need training on? We really need to connect it back to ultimately what's important for the business.
Yeah. So I mean, if we were to take that, then I suppose the core of any learning and development manager or leader is to be both a marketer at heart and an analytics, with a business kind of that business acumen of being able to understand understand the system they're working in, because it could be anything from a business to a startup to an NGO, anything. But I mean, you've got to understand the system that you're working in, and you've got to understand how to move the needle where it needs to be moved.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing for me is that often learning and development like HR comes from the humanities type of campus on universities, where there's not a lot of focus on commercial acumen, business acumen. It's very people-centric. And then the two somehow seem to be diametrically opposed, but yet they're very intertwined. So there is the question, I guess, is that is that the right place for people to be starting their journey in L&D? Is how do people get to that business acumen, and how do people change to start thinking that way, as opposed to what they're probably more inclined to be thinking is, I'm coming here to look after the people in this organization and see to their needs and make sure that they're learning, but not necessarily thinking in the other direction as well.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think so many people in L&D have had so many different routes into learning. We asked a few people recently on our online community, how did you get into learning and development in the first place? And I often have that conversation with people that I meet anyway, because I'm always really keen. And most people in our industry kind of went into it by accident. So I think firstly that's a problem, and I think that it's not been seen maybe as a career option when you're younger. It's not something that's ever kind of come up for me when I was at school or college or whatever. I do think we hear a lot more about kind of roles in HR, because we see that HR, you can get to an HR director. We don't often talk about L&D directors, and there's probably only a handful of companies in the UK that actually have L&D directors, or have people operating at kind of board level within their own right. You also get so many different L&D roles. So you get kind of roles that are working actually really operationally within the business, and then you get a lot of those that are working within HR. You get some that are working very specifically in a particular function, like commercial. And so the whole kind of system, I suppose, is different based on different organisations. But you also get there's a real and I suppose you get this in a few different roles actually. But in learning and development, I notice it a lot, and in sales as well. This is another one. where if you're really good at your job, people think that you'll be great at training it. And that's, I find that really interesting, because there's obviously a lack of respect for the skill needed in learning and development, that you just think you need to have subject matter expertise in, I don't know, whatever it is you're doing. So maybe you're a great salesperson and someone says, great, do you want to train others to be a salesperson? It doesn't really work like that. I mean, yes, sometimes people have brilliantly successfully transferred into learning from a kind of business role, and I would always encourage that. Because you're also coming with some great business knowledge as well, and how probably more commercially aware, actually. You know, to your point, those people are probably a lot more commercially savvy than those that have come via an HR route, for example. But if we're not going to invest in developing them properly and giving them the kind of basics, and making sure that they understand, you know, actually how adults learn, and we're not just going, great, you'd be good, I don't know, on a stage, then you know, we're going to have a problem. So I think back to your actual question, how do you kind of improve the kind of business knowledge and align people? I think a lot of it is about spending time with your stakeholders. Just jump into the business. I think you have a perfect opportunity when you first join a company in a new L&D role. Just take that first 3 months or however long you need and absolutely immerse yourself in the organisation, meet all of your key stakeholders, do some shadowing in their teams, understand how their teams tick, what their day-to-day looks like, what their challenges are like. You know, and if you're at a more senior level, really spend time with the other directors and the C-suite, and just ask questions, because you can do that when you're new. You can do it when you've been there years. It doesn't matter. There's never a wrong time to kind of ask. And I think that's what we probably need to do more of, really. Ask questions about the business, find out more about the business, and be part of it. Be part of it more, rather than talking about L&D being this separate function to the business. You know, we should be absolutely at the core of the business. So we need to start thinking differently, I think, now.
I mean, looking at it from the other side of the coin, though, I guess is interesting as well, because I think, you know, every L&D person would be furiously agreeing with you that yes, that's exactly that's got to happen, and yes, that's exactly what I need to do. But the other side of the picture is you know, you kind of intimated it when you talked about, you know, how the business tends to pluck people from successful roles into learning and development roles just based on subject matter expertise. So there's also a misunderstanding, it seems, of what learning and development is, what it should be. And I guess, as a, you know, put myself into the shoes of a learning and development person, you're kind of trying to be successful inside a machine that maybe doesn't understand you and what your role is, and what they need to do to help enable you to be successful. So you're kind of ending up with these two opposing forces, you know, who ultimately are trying to achieve the same thing, but maybe don't understand each other well enough. And I believe that is a perfect definition of conflict.
Yeah, and I think this is where learning and development need to get better at marketing learning. And, you know, that's not just marketing programs, that's marketing you as a function, and it's actually marketing you as an individual, to be honest. Because people will look at learning, and you will have a brand in your organisation, whether you like it or not, whether you know it or not. And there's that brilliant Jeff Bezos quote that your brand is what other people say about you when you're not in the room. It absolutely applies to learning and development. The rest of the business will have a view of what learning and development is, and it probably isn't the view you want them to have. But the only way you're going to find out is by asking them. And when you know what you've got to work with, you can then look at working on your kind of marketing plan and how do you change those views. And it's going to take a while for a lot of organisations, but that's a space I absolutely love working in. You know, helping organisations to kind of change their learning brand, their image, their reputation, because some of the things we just don't naturally think about, like the words that we use, the tone of voice in our messaging, the imagery and the logos and the colour schemes, everything builds up, to give people an impression of what you stand for and what you represent. And a lot of the time, L&D teams don't think about that. They don't give it enough proper thought. And you really have to. You've got to kind of own it and go, right, this is how we want to be. We want to be seen as a credible value-add function that's crucial to the success of the organisation, for instance. Okay, let's review where we are right now. Do people see us like that? Probably not. They see us as maybe a nice to have. Maybe some organisations see learning as just time off the job. Others see them as a cost centre because they just spend loads of money and they're not really seeing the return. So then how do you then go about changing those? And that's a whole big piece, but it's a topic I'm really passionate about, and I think more and more learning and development teams need to be focusing on their brand and their marketing in the business.
Well, there's also a word I want to throw in there, because it sits at the heart of any journey of change, is bravery, and I think that requires a lot of courage to be able to ask those questions, because essentially, one, you probably don't want to hear you're not going to be comfortable hearing the answer, so subconsciously you're probably avoiding the conversation. Two is you're probably going to be afraid of how that's perceived. Why am I suddenly being asked all these questions? Like, why is this person, kind of, I thought they knew all of this stuff, or like, what's the kind of agenda here? And I mean, three is ultimately it is a journey of change, because you've now got to take that information and now do something with it, which is also quite a daunting task. So how do you help people overcome like that obstacle, that almost like subconscious mental block of fear, or that fear of making that first step, potentially how they're going to be perceived by the C-suite when they start asking those questions?
It's difficult, and look, some people are going to respond a lot better than others, but ultimately the message is people are thinking what they're thinking about you or your team anyway. You're not changing what people are thinking, you're just finding out about it so that you can help to change and influence it. And I think to kind of be like an ostrich and stick your head in the sand is not a viable solution. And I think when people realise that actually their brand is already being perceived as X, Y, or Z, and people are already thinking ABC about them, you're just finding out about it. Yeah, it's scary to find out about it, but wouldn't you rather know so that you can change it? Or otherwise your option is just don't ask, but then nothing's going to change. And I think when you work with people, we're not quite that blunt, but when you work with people around that kind of messaging, generally people do realise, okay, yeah, you're right, this isn't actually as scary as I thought. It's going to be uncomfortable, absolutely, because you are going to be reading and listening to things that you're thinking, oh my God, I didn't know that, and I didn't know that, and I really hoped I wouldn't hear that, but God, as soon as you've heard it and you've got it and you've got all that data, that's fantastic. You've got it. A, the business feels listened to as well, so that's a massive positive. But B, you're already kind of almost publicly committing to making a change. So you look like you look like you are actually making a difference for the better of the organisation. And then you get the opportunity to take all that data and really apply it to how you want to be seen, heard and experienced in the business, and make real change in that space. So honestly, I think most people end up realising it's a bit of a no-brainer to do it. But I think you're right to call that out. It does maybe require people to be a bit brave. But ultimately you just have to keep reminding yourself that people are thinking it anyway, so you may as well find out. It's just like getting feedback from anything, isn't it? I mean, even running a training session, you ask for feedback, and sometimes you might kind of be looking at it like that, going, oh my God, I don't think that session went as well as it could have. But you have to ask, because you need to know, for next time, and you need to make it better, and you need to address it. So yeah, it's kind of like asking for feedback on a training program, really. I think we just need to get a bit braver, to your point.
So another thing that we talked a little bit about measurements and kind of moving the needle in the organisation, and I guess another point of interest for me is that requires almost a bit of a mindset change, because I think everybody's been taught up until now to focus on what they can control and what they can manage. So inevitably what ends up happening is I start to look at kind of adoption rates and completion rates, and if I'm feeling really really kind of good, I'll go about engagement rates as well. But how do you make that transition from kind of measuring the things that you feel that you have some control and influence over to starting to have that mindset of understanding how to link your environment and the kind of learning and development in organization into the outcomes of real business metrics? Because I find in my conversations that's normally where there's this massive divide. Is yes, I totally get that I need to be helping the organization be more profitable, but how do I actually bridge that divide? Because it's one thing to understand it, it's another thing to measure it, and then it's another thing to measure it in context to a learning initiative.
Yeah, and it's no small thing either, and that's probably another reason why it's something that has been, well, I guess the best word is a challenge for our industry for years, and it's constantly coming up. Particularly the whole how do I measure return on investment. And a lot of learning and development teams, I think, have this fear as well that if they don't demonstrate ROI, they're going to be made redundant the next time the business has a reorg. And we have seen that a lot with learning and development and teams like learning and comms and marketing. If you can't demonstrate enough the value of your organisation, then often you're in the firing line. Definitely more we can do about that, as I said, but also there's the business needs to look at things slightly differently as well there. I think the biggest piece for me when learning and development are looking at kind of impact measurement, it's actually connecting to your stakeholders. So I'm actually a massive fan of ROE rather than ROI, return on expectations, because if you're engaging your senior stakeholders up front before doing anything, you're having those conversations to understand where the kind of gaps are in their function, how you can improve performance for them, which then directly links to the direction of the organisation. What they actually want. So you're having that conversation with them. You're saying, what does good look like for you? Where do we need to get your team? How do we do this? And you're working collaboratively with your stakeholders in the organisation. Then I think when it comes to reviewing it afterwards and being able to measure that, it's a lot easier because you've got this whole kind of data set that you've gathered up front, and you know what you're aiming for. And actually for you to then go back to your stakeholders and say, well, look, you wanted this, you've got this. You wanted this, you've got this. And now let's build on this. What's stage 2? What's stage 3? And how actually has this improved 3 months, 6 months later? How has this improved the business? But I realise it's often difficult, and it's kind of a difficult one to answer as well, because every industry is different, and some industries it's so much easier to kind of measure I guess the success of learning and measure the value that you're adding, and in others it's a lot harder and takes an awful lot longer. And if you're looking at, I don't know, implementing, or you're trying to, I don't know, maybe create a new culture in your organisation, which obviously doesn't happen overnight, and let's say that's going to take, I don't know, 6-7 years, depends how big the company is. How do you measure that? It's really hard, but you need to kind of break things down, I think, and into small chunks. And as long as you're taking your stakeholders with you on the journey, I don't really think you can get it wrong, to be honest.
Yeah. I guess, I mean, the other thing that has always been kind of curious to me is I think it's that difference between empirical data and empirical measurements versus kind of anecdotal measurements. And so when you said return on expectations, it both sounded like yes, and then also hang on a second as a response, because the yes part is obviously you want to manage expectations. But the kind of cautionary component to that is expectations are emotions, and often it's anecdotal because you're asking someone their opinion as opposed to asking them facts. Like, this is what you wanted to achieve. Do you think we achieved that? Yes, I think you kind of achieved it. And whereas often C-levels and boards operate very analytically, and they're like hard empirical metrics. So I guess, in that sits this question of, it's actually two questions, is can you convert are there empirical measures in return on expectations that you can point to a very hard metric that's very measurable and you can kind of track it and progress it, versus do you think that there's more of a understanding and acceptance that sometimes kind of anecdotal or non-empirical measures are just as important as empirical ones?
Yeah, you're right to pick me up on that. And actually, I still think that conversations you have with stakeholders can be very data driven. I think you still, my expectation as sales director might be that I want my sales team to be selling 20% more this year than they were last year. I don't know, it could be, okay, it might be something that's a bit more anecdotal or harder to measure. It might be more of a kind of softer skill that we're working on. But then that's your job, I think, in learning and development, to take that and keep asking why. And go, okay, why do we want to improve customer experience? Why do we want our team to be more resilient? Why do you want them to be better at time management? And keep going, why? Because a lot of the time, the stakeholder won't even know that they might say, oh, my team need time management. Time management may not be the issue. It often isn't, actually. It's usually something else that's kind of sitting below the surface that's kind of an issue there. And that's your job. That's your job, I think, as a trusted learning advisor, as a business partner, to get under the skin of that and turn that into something tangible, because you're working with someone that says, okay, I need my team to be more resilient. Right. Okay, great. I mean, I could just accept that and go, great, we'll just start some resilience training. Or I could be saying, well, why do you need them to be resilient? And it's, well, I think that we're getting, a lot of people are, I don't know, going away with stress at the moment, or they're off with this, or they're not able to cope in this situation, or there's not enough bounce back when something occurs. Well, that actually, as a learning and development professional, that sounds to me like something's going on in that function that isn't happening in maybe other areas of the business that we need to delve into. So maybe the resilience thing isn't what we need to focus on. Maybe it's what's causing the lack of resilience, or is causing what you're perceiving as lack of resilience that's the problem. So I think you can keep asking why, and you get to a much more tangible result, actually. So it's you're absolutely right to pull that out. But I don't think at C-suite you can get away with much anecdotal. I think it's useful once you've demonstrated value, and you're in a position where you're already seen as a credible function in the business, and the value you add to the organisation is never questioned. Then great, you can start sharing anecdotal stuff, and people go, oh, that's brilliant, that's great, I'm so glad, that must be improving employee engagement, great. But most L&D teams are not there. So you're right, we absolutely have to be sticking to kind of more data-driven insights and kind of measurements, I think.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think, look, I mean, it's not easy, right? I mean, I ask those questions, but I can completely empathize. I mean, putting myself into the shoes, it would be a daunting task. And I pretty much spend most of my life trying to do exactly that, which is trying to translate learning initiatives into hard metrics. And sometimes you feel like you're taking a big chance and a big risk by trying to link a learning metric to a hard metric, because there's so many other variables at play. You're just by teaching someone something doesn't necessarily going to mean you need move the needle, because there are a whole bunch of other factors that are out of your control that need to be in place to make that needle move as well. So it's a very tough kind of place to be in. I can empathize with that.
And even in my situation now, running sort of CLA 100, we're looking at our learning leaders program, and we're going, well, how are we really going to measure success with this? Because you've got your kind of quick fire sort of survey questions, because you want to know immediately how well was this received, and what are your immediate thoughts on actually that workshop that you've just attended, because I need to know, and I want to know what's wrong with it. And that's the mindset you need to go into these things with. What's wrong with it? Not what did we do well so we can pat ourselves on the back. It needs to be what's wrong, what's broken, what can we do better next time. And you know what, if you don't get any of that, amazing, well done you, but I'd be dubious about that and think that maybe there's not an environment where people feel that they can share what's wrong. So I'd always be looking for what's wrong, what do we do better next time. But then equally, we were looking, and myself and Robert were thinking, well, how are we really going to be measuring this going forwards? And what we started to do with our delegates is firstly have an onboarding call with them to understand their current business challenges, their own personal development needs, and their learning and development kind of challenges within their business. And that gives us a really good idea of where they're at starting the programme. And we want to make sure that these initiatives throughout the year help them to kind of meet those challenges and their own personal objectives. But we know we're not going to do that just by running courses, and so everybody's also got a personal success coach to help them, and they'll all work differently with that coach to help them kind of embed their learning, we're helping them through reflection sessions to make sense of what they've learned at the end of every kind of core module. And I think the big thing as well, and this is what we often miss in learning, and actually a lot of this I think has suffered a bit with the I guess the reduction in the kind of face-to-face stuff, and don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting for a minute we all go back to purely face-to-face training, but I do think the community aspect and the network piece is absolutely massive when you're learning something, because you get so much from other people, and that's what we're hoping will happen we're seeing it already, to be honest, with this cohort, is actually they'll get so much from each other because there's such a diverse mix of industries, and everyone's going to have slightly different challenges and different ways of getting around that challenge and different perspectives, and that's something I think organisationally we need to look at in learning and development. It's actually how do we make the most of bringing people together, not just to learn a topic, but to learn from each other and to get different perspectives and to kind of actually build their network. Because again, that's something you need when you get to the C-suite. You need a network with you. You need to know that you've got support, and the people that understand you and maybe been on that journey with you. And I think that's a massive part of learning that we probably overlook a lot.
Yeah, it's one of the very hard lessons I learned, is that the higher up, the better a politician you need to become, because it's a lot of lobbying.
Yes.
When you want consensus on a decision, you've got to lobby a lot with people before you even introduce the idea.
Yeah.
So I mean to take a slight kind of tangent and just ask from the context of the CLO 100 course is. You talked a little bit about AI and other technologies, but looking forward as a chief learning officer now at, there's the kind of the fundamentals, like the baseline of how we learn and the value of experiential learning and how we can learn at scale and all of these kind of challenges, but sitting at the heart of that, kind of learning at scale, learning experientially challenged, kind of getting the most impact out of learning, comes the kind of this overwhelm of all of these different technologies that are starting to emerge in this space. And you kind of mentioned AI as one of them, but how are you kind of perceiving this, and how are you factoring into your course all of these different technologies and how people should just go about almost assimilating all of these different ones so that they can make a decision about what's the right tool for the job?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There's a lot out there now, and I think, I mean, in terms of AI, I mean, we as a business have thoroughly just jumped on it and embraced it. I mean, we're using it for lots of things, but it really helps to enhance. I think for us as a small business, when you've got limited resource in your organisation, if you're a small or a new business, AI is just going to make things so much easier for you. It's going to be so much cheaper. It's fascinating what we're able to use it for. And I think we'd have spent thousands by now on graphic design. We'd have spent thousands on marketing support. And actually we don't need to do that now. And so I think AI is massive. I think it's got huge potential for learning and development, absolutely enormous. And I hope people will gradually kind of get their head around it and move into a more positive space with that. And I know everyone's going to be on their own journey with it, and some are feeling quite, I think, scared probably, maybe unsure about what to do with it, not familiar with the tech. Some are actually fearful for their jobs. I think once we can kind of move past that and look at actually how it's going to enhance our jobs and free us up more to do the things that we should do in learning and development, all the human stuff, then I see it being really transformational. I still really think that there's a lot of potential for VR in learning. I think the immersive nature of VR is brilliant, and I've seen it working in some brilliant environments, particularly in those kind of high risk, high safety sort of spaces. I think it's an amazing tool. I mean, I know it's not going to work for everything, and probably it's still, whilst it's been around for a while, it's still a little bit experiential itself experimental. in a lot of ways. And I think that for us, with our program, we have we want to kind of role model, and we're working with some brilliant partners in a lot of different spaces to sort of role model the technology and use it ourselves throughout the whole 12 months. But then also we culminate the last 2 months of the program is all about innovation in learning, and how we can use technology and what that looks like. And I think different people are going to be resonating more with different tech because of the industry they're in, more than their own kind of personal preferences. It's just, if you're in a charity, for example, versus being working for a government department versus working in a corporate, you are probably going to have a different view of what's going to work in your business, what budget you've got as well, and how kind of useful it's going to be. But I see that whole space as really exciting, and it's only going to get more exciting. We're lucky because we're able to stay very agile with our program, because it's not on a fixed qualification framework, which is great for us, and particularly for the innovation module, because we're planning at the moment to be spending a lot of time in the kind of VR and AI space, but who knows what that's going to look like in 12 months time, and actually we need to be really flexible and ready to move with that. And luckily we can do. But I think working with as well some brilliant people that so Cathy Hoy, for example, she's recently written a book the other year called Learning Ecosystems, and she's just got a new one coming out actually. But she's actually doing a lot of work in the space of kind of what's coming next, what's sort of the future of tech in learning, and how can we kind of integrate this better within what we do in learning to the organisation. So I think we're doing what we can to showcase it throughout the year, but we're also going to have a dedicated sort of 2 months, I suppose, on learning innovation, and that's where really technology is going to come into play for people.
Cool. So I think then just maybe to close out is just for anybody who is interested in finding out more about the CLO 100 program, where do they go, and is there a qualification criteria? The programming, honestly, you can just search CLO 100, and I'm pretty sure we'll pop up. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. We've also got the CLO business page on LinkedIn if that's easier. In terms of qualification criteria, really the program is aimed at heads of learning that want to have more of a voice at an executive level, really have a seat at the table, want to be more kind of strategic within their learning function. So, that's our typical base. We're also open to aspiring heads of learning. So if you really feel like that's your next role and you want to prepare yourself ready for that, then we're also welcoming kind of aspiring heads of learning, and we're going to be opening the enrolment next month, so from March, ready for our September cohort. Brilliant. And we always like to end off with if you can share with us book, podcast, anything that you've experienced recently that's kind of created an epiphany, an aha moment, or had a fundamental impact on you.
I would say I'd actually say, and I know I mentioned it earlier, but I'd actually say that if anyone wants a recommendation, the AI for the Average Joe podcast is really worth checking out. I think if you're really new in the AI space, then that's a really great place to start, because I just think that's a lot that people are focusing on right now, and there's a lot of information out there, and I think we've seen a lot of AI experts that have appeared in the last 6 months, and it's really daunting because you don't know who really is and who isn't. And I think the work that Erica Haley and the team at Quantum Rise are doing there is really good. So I would say check their podcast series out. Brilliant.
Well, Cathy, it's been a great conversation, and really do wish you all the best and lots of success for the CLO 100 program, and good luck with your first cohort, and hopefully we can follow this up in future and hear about the success of your program.
Oh, thank you, Jason. No, thanks very much for having me.
Hey, thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Impact Learning Visionaries. If you found it interesting or helpful, please subscribe by clicking on the button down below so you don't miss our next one. Also, be sure to check out our Reality Bites blog for more information on how technology is aiding in learning development. Links are all in the description below. Go check it out. Thanks a lot. Bye.